Morning, everybody. Welcome. I am Vanessa Timmons and just so delighted to be here this morning. Bonnie, do you want to say your name?
I'm Bonnie Badenoch, and I'm so glad that we can be here too.
Great. We really wanted to thank Bettina and the National or the Natural Lifemanship Program for having us here today. It's just a wonderful opportunity to share something that's very passionate for me and I think very passionate for Bonnie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's so good to be here, my friend. It's just really good. So how are you today? We always
I'm
check
doing,
in first.
yeah, I wanted to start with check-in. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's, I'm pretty tender this morning. It's the anniversary of my mother's passing this week. So it's been a very busy weekend with lots of ceremony in honor of her and lots of tenderness. And I couldn't think of a better way to honor her than having these embodied conversations about racism. My mother was quite the activist, so this is quite an honor, like a dedication in her honor. But I've also asked you to take lead today because it is a tender morning, and so I'm just gonna follow my leadings and be with you all this morning in a very tender and joyful way.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah,
How are you? How are you doing
I'm
this morning?
glad today. I've been having some anxieties about the condition of our country and our planet on a kind of in waves, the crest and all of that. But I'm feel so blessed to get to be here with you today and with everyone who comes that seems to be in the background. And so I look out at this enormous trees outside my window here, and it's very calming. So I'm just glad to be here, and I'm glad to take the lead and know that as you feel moved to offer things, it'll be very beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we often talk about in this work, this anti-racism work, is the role of allyship. So I just want to honor you in your role of ally today as you support me in this tender way. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. It seems very natural. We've had a 10-year or so friendship, and so my heart is always with you. So
Yes.
we want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are standing in two different places. I'm up in Port Townsend, Washington, and you're down in Vancouver. And so the Squalum tribe, as best we know, were the traditional owners of this area of land. And for in the Vancouver area, it seems that some of the Chinook tribes were the traditional owners of that land. And so to acknowledge that we stand here, we sit here, and both ask their blessing and their forgiveness.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I just really want to extend from my ancestors to their ancestors deep appreciation for their stewardship of this land and the gifts and legends and opportunities that their lives provided for our lives. So I
Yeah.
reach out to them as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is called a compassionate conversation, right? This is a wonderful way for us to talk about something that's frankly very, very prevalent and up in our culture right now, is how do we begin to talk about race and racism, and particularly anti-racism, and how do we reconcile our history? In meaningful ways, right? In ways that really respect the journey that we've been on as individuals and collectively. And so the first thing that we like to do is just invite people into their bodies and just remind you that this is a conversation of the heart and of the spirit. Um, and ask folks to just kind of settle into your body, close your eyes, listen deeply, take breaths, get a warm cup of tea or coffee, a glass of water, relax your belly, as Bonnie always says to us, and just be in this hour and a half on your Sunday morning, We just invite you to listen with your whole self and participate with your whole self. And we are so grateful to welcome you here. Bonnie, did you want to add anything?
No, just that, I think again, the area around the heart and around the belly is such tender territory for us. And if we can relax into that, the wise voices inside of us speak through sensation in those areas. And so, yeah, maybe especially as we begin with this poem that I know you're going to read, which always just touches me all through here every time I hear it.
Yes, this is a poem by our good friend Marshall, and I'm just going to read it this morning and thank Marshall for this work as I read. It's called A Privileged Tale. I am tired of carrying these bags. Who can I get to haul this extra weight? You there, carry my bags. Ah, yes, this feels nice. I feel free to move now. And suddenly I realize I should have never had to toil so. You there, since you're already carrying my bags, carry my food. I'll still want to eat it all. Clearly, I'm more important because only one of us is walking free. Though I don't like how you are looking at the food. I don't trust you with it, but I also don't want to carry it. What a stressful problem. Do you see how hard my life is? Plus, why do I have this coat when I'm not currently cold? You there. Since you have my bags and food, take my coat. How frustrating for me that you move so slow. That's more proof that I'm superior. See how nimble I am? You should really be able to keep up. Now, I'm suddenly aware that even items in my pockets make me feel less free. You there, take these things from me. Nothing should hinder me. I'm too essential to be held back in the slightest. But don't steal my things. Your role is to hold my baggage, but don't think you have the right to use it. And stop asking for help. Do you think you are owed free handouts? After all this time struggling to keep up, what have you done to deserve help? Work harder like me. I'm getting so much done all on my own. But I might one day need to know how to carry heavy weight. I haven't had the practice. I feel insecure even thinking about it. Surely I can find a teacher. You there,
Mhm.
by Marshall Lyles.
I probably heard that poem 30 times now, and it just touches me through and through about, the burdening that has been placed on Black people and is still placed on Black people while we walk free as though we have no part in it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know Marshall has indigenous blood, and uh, I'm really reminded of that. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and something that I've heard often is, yeah, but I need boots before I can do that. And this poem really resonates that idea of just, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, but I have no boots, I have no straps.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mm.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for reading that, and thank you, Marshall, for giving the world that sense, that ability maybe to sense a little more deeply where we are and how we got here.
It's a really wonderful way to enter the work. And so, Bonnie, I'm going to just talk a little bit about why we're here. Like, what was our intention? I know that this moment kind of started really like easily with a conversation in your living room when we were kind of frustrated. It was early in the pandemic, and we were frustrated with everything going on, and wondering what we might do. You know, what might we offer? And it just came that we might just offer our friendship and our conversations that we so often have with each other. And so we were really excited to do that. But and so we really wanted to frame this as an embodied conversation, like just one of the many conversations that we have had through our friendship and through our time together. And came up with a simple structure to just talk about the history, right? What is the history of oppression, of racism as we understand it? What have we noticed kind of in that larger collective history of racism in America? But also from an embodied interpersonal way. Like this is not going to be an intellectual conversation about like facts, right? It's like what is our felt experience of the history? What is our embodied relationship with our history? And what have we learned about how that history impacts us, which moves us to that personal piece, right? That personal story, and how that history and how our personal experiences with race have shaped us, have shaped our lives, have shaped our work, have shaped our relationships with one another. And then ultimately, what do we do with that? Like how do we heal? What are our ideas about how we heal? And what do we want to see moving forward in the future? Um, yeah, and that we're just really here to make an offering of our thoughts and to invite other people's thoughts into our thoughts.
Yes. And their bodies into this conversation of bodies too. You know what we feel hearing the poem, what we feel hearing you speak right now, things that may arise as I speak. You know, just to really honor all of that is very, very meaningful. You know, whether that's discomfort or whether that's ease, whether that's tears, whether that is a sense of peace. You know, we can never know what will come up next.
Now, there's definitely great complexity right now around these issues, and I feel like it really makes them even more critical and more beautiful. Is that there is a great complexity, and that I feel, I don't know how others feel, but I feel like we're finally able to take a breath and have the hard conversations that have been necessary, but not necessarily prevalent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and to broaden ourselves to include whatever discomforts come along with that. And something you say to me often that I really hear is there's a difference between discomfort and true lack of safety. That it's
Yeah.
really okay to be quite uncomfortable as we move into this, you know, on both sides of the conversation, wherever that may be. That discomfort is not a bad thing, but I think it's often the door that's opening to the possibility of change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Bonnie. Exactly. So did you want to say anything else about our intention today and what we're hoping to to talk about, or did I leave anything?
I don't think so at all. The
Okay.
only thing I want to add is that there's a foundation for me on which this work stands, and a curiosity about why we even have to do this work. And that is, I've been a student of relational neuroscience for, I guess, about 17 years now. And it's helped me to understand more who we are at our core. What kind of beings are we as human beings? You know, regardless of color, regardless of anything else, what is it that's at our core? And what this new relational neuroscience teaches us is that instead of being beings who are at war inside by nature, which is kind of the old Freudian way of seeing it,
Mm.
is that we are born with this capacity to connect, to be empathic with one another, to welcome each other, to hold each other in tenderness and care. It's built right into our neurobiology as the very core of who we are. And so my question then becomes, how on earth did we get so far away from this in the way we treat each other now? What's happened to us? Because only trauma could explain how it is that we got moved so far away from what our deepest yearnings are as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a wonderful kind of introduction into our conversation about the history. Like, right? How did we get here?
Yeah, how did we get here? And I be asking that question, and then I've been, I really have to acknowledge the depth of my. Uh, I would have intermittent awareness of the struggles of African Americans in general, of you, of other people, of indigenous people. I would have intermittent awareness, and then I have the privilege to forget about it, which I would do for very long periods of time. In the midst of everything else, it would just slip away from me. And so it's been quite an ongoing thing ever since George Floyd's murder to begin to be awakened enough, like shaken awake, to begin to do a lot of reading. And I have to pause sometimes because if I read too much, I can't digest it. And I just feel
Right?
confused. I
Exactly.
have to really like eating a good meal. I have to read and be with, and then maybe explore something more. And so that's kind of what happened for me around the history of white people. What did we bring with us from Europe when we set foot on this land, and then encountered the indigenous people here, and then by 1619, we're now bringing African people against their will here and turning them into our slaves. What did we bring that let us be dehumanized enough to be able to do that? So in doing some reading and being curious about that, there's a couple of things that have become agonizingly clear to me. And one is that we were a very traumatized people when we came. And I want to say right now, this doesn't let us off the hook for the horrible things that have happened.
Right. Right.
It helps us
Absolutely.
put it in a frame where maybe we aren't so disabled by shame that we can't do anything. Some
Mhm.
depth of understanding of what happened to white people before they came here. Living in Europe had so many traumatic experiences day in and day out. There was so much already of hierarchy and oppression. There was so much of who the rich were and who the poor were. There was so much religious persecution that went on. There was so much plague that was happening also. So, boy, so parallel to what we're experiencing now, these plagues that would wipe out half the people in the village. I mean, that in and of itself is a huge trauma. And then the way that people were punished for minor offenses, even they could be drawn and quartered, they could actually be pulled apart by horses. They could be, they could have limbs removed. So there was a constant sense of threat. And by way of protection, there began to be a hardness about people and a way to try to somehow incorporate these awful experiences into daily life. And as that began to happen, there could even be ways that communities would compete to be the community to host an execution where there was a kind of carnival atmosphere. And as
Yeah.
I was reading that, I could feel tears and just the startling feeling of the pictures I've seen of,
Mhm.
of white people having a picnic as they were lynching Black people. And I thought this is almost one-to-one correlation of what was experienced and stored in the bodies in this epigenetic way, these old patterns that are stored in our cells and just in all of our experience. And how then, if these aren't healed, they begin to replay themselves, and they replay them at this horrible expense, both to our indigenous communities and in ways that more and more I'm coming to understand became just the way we treated especially the Africans who were brought here,
Mhm.
not only to do the work but also to be abused and take the brunt of what it is that happened to us. So there's that part that just rips at my heart. And then understanding more and more through a man named Joseph Henrich, who writes about how our actual brains were changed by some of the patterns of not just the
Mhm.
traumas, but just that even learning to read and become a literate group instead of an oral tradition kind of group begins to change our brains, that pulls us away from being able to be our most human selves with each other. It takes the energy out of the relational circuitry and puts it into words in the left hemisphere, this kind of left hemisphere way of dehumanization. And so while I have some quarrels with his book, mainly because he's a Western white male that is not as wise about indigenous ways and their value, but what he's writing about in terms of the change of the very circuitry in our brains that made it harder for us to see other humans. I mean, there was a lot of violence perpetrated against each other when we came here, burning people at the stake.
Right, Bonnie. And I think that, there is, like with embodied conversations, we're talking about the pain of the history, right? And I think that there is a way that it's hard for people to hear white people talk about the pain of their history, but I do feel like it's an important part of it. And I just want to restate what you said earlier about it not being a justification, because I just know that you and I have had these conversations publicly for a while, and I just want to pause and state that again.
Is in no way a
Yeah,
justification. There's never
yeah.
a justification for harming another human being and to harm
Mhm.
groups of human beings in the way that Africans were harmed. There can't be any justification. But I think if we don't get to a sense
Yes.
of the trauma in us, we're not going to be moved to work to heal it, because we are carrying that legacy now, along with the legacy of everything that we did to Black people when they came here, to Black
Mhm.
bodies, white bodies harming Black bodies. And so again, if I don't have a living sense of that trauma history,
Mhm.
I'm not going to be moved to do the things to change it that are going
Right.
to let me truly be an ally. So I think I had shared with you, Vanessa, that I had a dream one night. And in that dream, I was alternately in the state of being in whatever my mind, was holding about that, of being a Black person in the hold of the ship. And then I was moved to be the master of the ship. And then back to feeling the sense of this terrible bondage and torture. And then back to the coldness. And
Mhm.
it gave me that sense of, oh my gosh, how much of humanity must have been destroyed that he could do this, that this master of the ship could do that, and how much anguish and confusion and terror and horror that was happening below. And so I think we need to, if we can, hold both of those
Mhm.
things as best we can in order to be moved, so that we aren't are carrying less and less of that heritage in ours, that because otherwise we can make structural change, but if there's not also this change, it's going to be extremely hard to maintain it, because we've seen it happen over and over and over again in history, that we make them, there's a move toward and it's cut off, like Reconstruction stopped after 10 years because we could not bear to allow this change to happen. So
Right.
that's why I care about it.
Right, because it's part of that difference between discomfort and a lack of safety. And sometimes, if you don't know or acknowledge, I think everyone knows the trauma that they carry, but if we don't acknowledge the trauma, then discomfort can feel like unsafety. And the
Yeah.
reaction to that can be a tremendous shutdown, which is what we've seen collectively in our country.
A shutdown and then a perpetration of that trauma over and over and
Yeah,
over again, as a
absolutely.
result of it being unhealed, because what isn't healed gets acted out somewhere.
Yeah.
And in that distinction between Black bodies and white bodies, there's like a defined target for that trauma, and it's so wrong. It's so painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
So did you want to say anything else about history, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I really was. I just was having to pause for a minute. I mean, it actually hurts my physical heart to think about this and talk about it. Yeah, and I was just going to say, I would love to hand it off to you to talk about history from your perspective. And
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm going to start by just reading a definition because I feel like it's really uniquely my history, right? This definition of what it is to be enslaved, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I use the word enslave instead of a slave as well. This is a definition of chattel slavery. A chattel slave is an enslaved person who is owned forever and whose children and children's children are automatically enslaved. Chattel slaves are individuals treated as complete property to be bought and sold. Chattel slavery was supported and made legal by European governments and monarchs. So I just invite you to take a breath there and be with that experience that my ancestors lived through. And I am lucky because I'm here, which is an indication that they did survive it. Millions and millions did not survive it. So I also want to talk about just the experience of that, of being enslaved and not having the right to your humanity. I think that's one of the most deeply troubling parts of the enslavement of African peoples was that they were not considered human. And I think the lack of being considered human allowed horrific, inhumane conditions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Middle Passage, which is the journey that African peoples made from Africa to America and to some of the other islands around America. And I went to a museum in Memphis, the African American Museum of History, I think it's called. And they had a lot of interesting artifacts and exhibits there. But the one that I want to talk about was an image of the slave ship. And I, as a Black person, born of people who love to talk about history, this was not the first time I had heard this story, but it was the first time that I saw a depiction of the experience. And the experience was of enslaved Africans in the hull of a slave ship. And as they were in the hull of the slave ship, they were chained and they were bent over. They could not sit upright, and so they were folded like this and chained together. They were given no food or water. Of course, no place to go to the restroom. The enslaved Africans were of every age. There were children, there were women, there were men, there were pregnant women in that ship. And they just did the long journey forward. What the stories that have been told in my family are of folks being, as people died, sometimes people were chained to other bodies of the dead. Sometimes the dead were thrown overboard. Sometimes the sick were thrown overboard. This was a horrific journey that they were forced to make. Once here in the Americas, they were put on display and sold. I think one of the other pieces of the enslavement of African peoples that has lasted in the storytelling of my ancestors is the story of not being able to hold together as family. African people, like all people, value most deeply their relationships to one another, the relationship of husband to wife, of mother to child, of father to child. Even in African traditions, that is extended deeply to our grandparents and our aunties and our cousins are like siblings to us. And during the enslavement, African people were not allowed to hold those kinship bonds. Those kinship bonds were broken and were considered meaningless. And so a child could be born one moment and ripped from its mother the next. A husband and wife could jump the broom or be married in one week and pulled apart for the next. Many African people didn't know who their kin were. And so because of this forced separation, along with the forced enslavement, those human kinship bonds were broken, which was devastating to our psyche and our human spirit. The other thing I think is interesting or important to talk about when we talk about the history of enslaved peoples was the resistance that these people, that my ancestors utilized. And the resistance, people talk about enslaved individuals and their resistance. There was definitely revolts. There was resistance as violence, absolutely. But there was also a different kind of resistance. And this is something that I took great comfort in as a child, which is this resistance through music, this resistance through dance, this resistance through connection with nature, with plants and trees and other living beings, this resistance that literally said, whether or not you accept my humanity, I am going to live it. I'm going to live it through creativity, through celebration, through connection, through engagement, and more than anything else, through story, so that the next generation knows that they too are human. And so I will just leave it at that.
No, I sometimes feel like I could just listen to you talk forever, and that something inside me would change.
I
Just
love
from
you too, Bonnie. I love you too, my friend, deeply.
Yeah, the pain of it is just almost, I mean, as a white woman, to require myself to continue to attend, no matter how painful it is to hear this, and to feel not my personal complicity, but but as a member of society, the complicity and how it's ongoing in that way, is just
It's staggering. Yeah. And
staggering, but it's the most valuable thing, I think, and it's the way that you speak of it from your heart that can open my heart. It's just and even and to hold that amount of pain.
from my people to yours.
Yeah.
Like those are the stories of my grandparents. My grandmother, Roberta, was actually, her mother was born enslaved. And so I had direct access to the stories of that time through her. And only shared a tiny bit today, but the stories of rape, of forced, um, uh, you know, forced pregnancy. Um, yeah, those stories were living stories for my generation, and they're living stories for my grandchildren now, as I teach them,
Yeah.
from which they came and the resiliency and strength that they come from.
Yes, and there's, as painful and horrible as it is, there's a beauty in that continuity of
Mm-hmm.
connection that we as white people don't have much of that. The kinship bonds were broken down so early in us that we don't have a sense of community and joining. It's just part of us or of the story. Most of us don't carry that. And I feel like that's a gift you give to me to get to feel into that with you.
Well, for us, it was the medicine, right? There's a way that our stories of who we came from and what they survived. There's a Maya Angelou poem that says, I am the gift and the hope of the slave, right? That won't have meaning if I don't know what the slave survived for my life to be possible,
That's right.
right? Their job was survival, and nobody made that easy, but they did it, and I'm here.
Yes. And they did it together somehow, even with the broken personal kinship bonds. There was a way that the knowing about the importance of connection and relationship was so deeply embedded that that there was other kin. I mean, like you've spoken to me about that. Everybody around you is part of that kinship circle. It's not only blood. It's this
No,
broader sense of kin that
yes.
again, if I walk into a room of white people who are strangers to me, I don't feel connected. I don't feel that kinship
Mm,
just based on who I am in some way as a white person. It's just not there. And I know that that's different for many
yes,
for many people of color. And I think
yeah,
it's how survival happens under the most unimaginable conditions.
yeah, yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, So I guess you feel ready to slide into our next part about our own stories about this.
Absolutely.
It's a little hard to go on from there, honestly. It's kind of like want to just sit with it for a long time and
Mm.
absorb it. But I think we also have to honor the left hemisphere's need to move forward since we have
Yeah, the history is rich. I
it
think the
is.
last thing I'll say about the history part is that, just as folks out there in the audience that are with us this morning, um, is to just remember your history, be in the embodiment of the history, and let it be a guide for you because it is through story, our history is a living medicine,
Mhm.
right? That is how history becomes medicine, is through story.
Yes. And I don't think our white bodies know much about that, honestly. I really don't. For
Well, your
some,
ancestors did.
wonder, I don't know. I'm so European that I'm not sure that the losses that happened even as early as the 1500s didn't really prevent that kind of medicine from developing in any profound way. Anyway, it can be reclaimed, I think, as we listen and feel into and internalize each other. I have a very strong Vanessa inside of me that helps me relate differently in so many areas. And I'm so grateful. So I think the next thing we want to touch on is to invite everybody who's here today into your own story, regardless of what your origins are, what skin color, what body you might be in, and who your ancestors are. We all have a personal story about our relationships, racial relationships, based on what happened to us in our early lives. And so this has really caused me to reflect on what I took in that very personal way around all of this. I from 7 on, I was we had a sudden shift in fortunes, and we moved into a very white, waspy enclave. And I went to school there for grade school and for junior high. And so I don't believe there were any people of color at all, at all in my life, except
Mhm.
that we had a Black maid. And my parents felt like they were very magnanimous because they allowed her to eat at the dinner table with us, and very magnanimous because my mother would give her her cast off clothing. And that at the time was just something I observed. I don't know what all it meant inside of me, but again, the hierarchy was just assumed. And so that had to have gone inside of me somewhere and helped to create the blindness that I've had, that this is just the way it is. And our Black maid expressed great gratitude and kind of deference to my parents. And that's really painful for me now to reflect on that, because I think that having to appease white people is so ground into so many people, especially back then. That was in the 50s. I'm a little old lady. So that was back in the 50s. Had been so ground in that there wasn't really any other way for this Black woman to respond except in that way of gratitude and deference, no matter what she might have felt inside. Or maybe she couldn't even let herself feel anything else inside because it would have been too dangerous.
Yeah.
So I really see that as a legacy now of like, like slavery reenacted, only now there's monetary exchange and you get clothes, but the patterns of it, the relational patterns of it are still there, and I'm seeing it and I'm living with it. And I have to say our household was so profoundly traumatic to the kids there. I didn't really have the bandwidth to reflect on any of it, but I know that I took it in. I know that I took in this pattern. So then when I'm in junior high, we didn't have a high school in our town. So had to be bused across town to the big, huge 3,000 person high school in Pasadena, far away. And that meant we were going to be in a school that was probably about 1/3 African American, about a third white, and then I'm sure there was some Hispanic people there, but I have no memory of that. But there was a fairly large group of Asian people. And all of us that were going to go there were told by the people sending us there, I believe what they believed was a gesture of kindness, so that especially the girls should watch out for the Black girls, because the Black girls carried knives in their beehive hairdos and would steal our lunch money. That's what I was told going into that school. And I have no personal experience with African American people to have any other thing. So I went there scared, So we're on our nice white little bus, and we come up to the school and all of that, and we were told to also never walk alone in the halls because we might be attacked. So to this day, I have no idea what the reality was about any of that. I have no idea because I was so scared. And then there was the interesting experience of being in class together and of feeling, I don't know quite how to say it even, but kind of shied away, like drawn back into myself. And I was pretty shy and pretty traumatized, so I didn't even have a lot of white friends, but of this feeling constantly underneath. And I can't imagine what that telegraphed to the Black kids, to see these scared faces. I don't think I ever looked hostile. I didn't turn it into hostility, because that's the thing you can certainly do when you're scared. But I was way too scared to do that. But there was no welcome from me, because I was so frightened already based on nothing anybody ever did to me. There was no sense that any of that was going on, but I was so frightened about it, and always did. At least we walked in little white groups around campus. So there was never any opportunity to test it out until my junior year. But that first 2 years, it was really amazing. And then after school, there was this and at lunch also, but after school especially, there was this self-segregation. All the black kids parked over here in the parking lot and all the white kids parked over here in the parking lot. And I think the Asians just got in their cars and left because they don't have anything to do with what was going on. And the black kids would fight with each other and the white kids would fight with each other. So there was so much tension in the air that there would be these battles going on, but it was completely
Mm.
segregated. There was never, ever once that I recall any time where there was any tangling between the white kids and the black kids. So that's
Mm.
a really interesting phenomenon too, you know. So then I got to be in my junior year and I joined the Girls Athletic Association. And there had to be a real intermixing of black bodies and white bodies. And again, I don't remember any Asian kids in that group. But
Mm.
we got to know each other as human beings because we were playing on the same teams. We got to care about each other. We got to have a common goal together. And as a result of that, I I just had I feel like it split me in two because I had this other experience
Mm.
that was still going on of group consciousness. And then I had this other experience of having real friendship with certain kids. And so there was my friend on this, I wasn't very good at sports except softball. I was a really good pitcher. I was very valued on the softball team, even though I couldn't run or hit. But they like that I could really get that ball over the plate. And I had a really good friend who was my catcher, who was this wonderful, wonderful black girl. And so we became really, really close. And we both ran for treasurer of GAA and she won. And that was, we didn't care. And so I have, to this day, I can see her face and I feel this really warm feeling. In fact, whenever I'm with you, she was tall and strong like you are. And so the two of you get all twisted up inside of me in this really beautiful kind of way.
That's lovely.
And so at the end of our year, I said asked my parents, I'd like to have a party and I want to invite these people. And they knew who she was. And they said, absolutely, she cannot come. And I said, absolutely, we are not having that party. So that may be my one act as a kid where I can actually say that there was a value in the personal relationship that was so strong that I actually took a stand, which was not the norm in my family. And I feel happy about that. And I do feel her very much part of me in my heart, to this day. But I didn't just carry
Mm.
that forward. I also carried all this other confusing mess, both from earlier in life and then from really early when we had our maid and on up and then this mess at school that was again created by other white adults by instilling fear in us. So I know that that's part of the all of those things are part
Yeah.
of the heritage. So then I go off to college and our student body president is a black man. He became the student body president. And I know you and I have a few other friends who are black people and they're everybody's kind of at the same socioeconomic
Mm.
education interest level. So that's lovely, except that what it does is let me just completely, it makes me feel like we're all the same. So let
Mm.
me completely ignore that other things are going on in your life outside of our relationship until recently, to begin to consider that you're living an entirely different life in terms of fear, in terms of how you're looked at, in terms of how you're disappeared, that I don't have to deal with at all. So while I'm so grateful for those friendships and relationships that I've had, I also feel how it made me completely blind because of our commonalities. I never
Mm.
asked the question, and what is your day-to-day life like? What do you have to deal with as a Black person? I won't
I
make
remember, I remember when you first asked me that. And remember we were
yes.
talking, you were like, and I was like, oh, okay, it's gonna get real.
And I'm so grateful. I want to know.
Yeah.
I want to know, and I want to stand beside you, and I want to be strong enough to not be so horrified that I'm useless. I want to stand in strength with you in these things. But I think, as you know, all of us, if we can, can let ourselves go back in our histories and feel what we learned, it really intertwines with systemic racism and how we relate to it, how we're able to be with it, how we're able to be supportive of change. I think if we ignore that dimension of what's going on inside of us, we lose something. And so anyway, that's my story, and I want to hear. Every
That's
time we talk
beautiful,
about this, I
Bonnie.
get to hear different stories from you about your history of what it was to be a Black little girl and a Black teenager,
Yeah,
Black woman.
yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. As I was listening to your story, I'm struck by what a powerful tool fear is in keeping us apart and in perpetuating oppression of multiple kinds, including
Yeah.
racism. Yeah. Yeah. So how do I want to approach history, my personal history? I think I'm going to start with what I heard, right? And kind of because, story seems to be what's rising today. And so I remember hearing my elders talk about oppression and slavery in very real ways, but also in like painful ways, but also very practical ways. My father talked about walking home from school. He was probably third grade, because my father stopped going to school around third grade. He didn't feel safe anymore. And I think this story was part of why. But he was walking home and found his slightly older brother, which would have been maybe under 12, hanging from a tree. Somebody, we never as a family learned who, had hung him. Um, and that was one of the stories. Another that shaped me, right there. I'm taught. When I was thinking about how fear has become a tool, I was thinking so many of those stories and what I heard were stories teach caution, to teach caution, and to express like the fear that I felt all around me, right? It was to kind of give context to that fear. Stories always have purpose, right? Yeah. My grandmother, this is my grandma Minnie Bell. Her face just popped into my mind. She told stories about resiliency and resistance. She talked about how when the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, who in Hooks, Texas, where my family is from, they were law enforcement in Hooks. The KKK were the law enforcement. And so she talked about how they would come into the community of Hooks. And my family owned 70 acres of land, black walnut forest. They still own it. It's been in my family for many generations. Um, and there's a river that runs through the land that the greater towns around it would want access to. And so my grandmother would talk about how they would just come riding in to take property, to loot land, to loot resources, and that one of her jobs was to hide the male children of the family under the floorboards of her house. And my grandmother's house literally had human storage under it, which reminds me a little bit of the slave ship and how it was in the hole, right? And so that was another story. Now, my family moved from Hooks, Texas when my father was older, and married my mother. They moved from Hooks, Texas to Portland, Oregon. Quite a journey. And when, when they moved up here, it was really about that move was really about kind of escaping that oppression. But when my grandmother, who was such a brave, strong, amazing woman, when she would make the journey up and I would be like ready to show her my friends and go to the store and all this stuff, what I remember most about her was how much her body was afraid. Like I can just feel it in my body as I even talk about her. Like that she would be holding my hand, and if I was, playing with a white, almost all of my friends were white Jewish kids who I just adored. And they were just my buddies, in Jewish homes, we were just running in and out. And honestly, I didn't feel a difference between my Jewish white friends and myself because our homes were so connected. We were in a Jewish neighborhood. And so, but my grandmother, when those kids would come running in and I'd be like, oh, so-and-so, Ruth is here, or Rebecca's here, my grandma's body would tense and she would grab my hand and she would hold it tight and her whole body, and she'd pull me close. And the message was always, don't trust, don't let your guard down, let me tell you a story. So my grandmother never recovered from, one of her children being hung in a tree. She never recovered from the looting and the random use of law enforcement to try to take what belonged to them. And she never recovered from all of that. Like that, she carried that in her body without ever saying a word. I think that was just part of the history. From my personal history. The other thing that I think happened for me and part of my personal history is I was born in 1964. And so I was born into a time when a lot of justice work was happening. And my parents would always take me to protests and marches. My sister is, she's a law enforcement officer, but she was during the 70s, she was one of the Black Panthers, right? So she had all of this activity there, and started a chapter in Vancouver, Washington, of all places. It's just like, I think it was her and my cousins and a couple of our Jewish friends were Black Panthers. But I think that, that really taught me that the way toward healing was justice, right? That to me, I don't feel a difference between wholeness and healing and justice. To me, it feels like if there's no liberation for all people, like this full liberation of our humanity as a species, like if there's not that, then we're not whole or healed. Because my grandmother was such a healed person to me, but the lack, because she lived in and had experienced such injustice, fear gripped her body throughout her entire life.
Yeah.
So I think being born when I was and having the experiences of real active anti-racism work, like in my life, especially my early life, anti-racism work wasn't just a word, it was an action. Like we were literally taking blankets to the front lines and making sure that, people's harmed bodies were healed, right? My aunties, we were good with the aloe vera to, make sure that people who were beaten or kicked or sprayed had, I can tell you a million different ways to get pepper spray off your face, right? And that's from direct experiential knowledge, right? Get the milk, wash your face, get the cloths, get the aloe vera, heal those who are fighting for the justice of our species, because this is hard work but it's essential work. And I learned that in a practical way. What else do I want to say about patterns? I think that I also learned very early on from going, being in a very white environment. Like I grew up in rural Washington state, was born in Portland, Oregon. I lived there until I was about 6 weeks old. And then my family moved to what looks like a little area between Camas, Washington and Vancouver, Washington. So I learned that, one of my absolute favorite memories, which is weird, was getting up really early in the morning. And I mean, like at 3 a.m., getting like all of us, like me, my family, the lower income Jewish families, the Latinx families, we all get on these buses and go out to pick berries and beans and things like that. So one of my favorite memories is how the women would throw out these huge blankets and pile all us little ones on it. And we would be eating tamales and, brisket, just all these different foods while our parents picked fruits and vegetables. And to me, community didn't have a skin color, but it had a shared liberation, this sense of essential shared liberation that we, until, that we're in this together, but justice liberates us. And so I think that's what my tribe looks like now. It looks like lots of different kinds of people, but we never lose track of how each of us are individually experiencing oppression, and that our struggles are similar but different, but they are struggles.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, it's really something being both a Black woman and a Jewish woman. You get
Mm-hmm.
oppression from all different angles. I mean, more than one flavor of it.
Yes, I forgot to say that I became Jewish. Yes, because my love of those were my people.
Yeah. Yeah. It really speaks to me of the kind of work that you do, because you have been so involved with again, people of all colors, but of similar oppressive kinds of things, because of your work with domestic violence and child sexual assault, which you have led so beautifully in Oregon for I don't know how many decades now, my dear.
Gosh, it's been like 30 years now, or no, almost 42. Yeah.
Wow. So with all of that, history inside of you, but you have room for a lot of diversity of people with the commonality of no justice and oppression. It's really a beautiful thing. I don't think I ever quite understood that as fully as I do in this moment, listening to you.
Mm.
And what a gift you have made out of these kinds of, experiences. And so
Yeah, it's interesting how our history, our personal history, really does shape um, how we approach our anti-racism work, right? Like if we have, and how much fear, I think it's really important for us to think about is how do we learn fear of one another as children? Like, because we both learned it.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Sometimes it was directly taught, and other times it was in much more subtle ways and patterns that just operate around us and get into our implicit memory and just become the way that we see it, or the ignoring. I mean, the capacity to have a privileged ignoring is because,
Yeah.
I mean, as I think back to education in school, we kind of drifted through, Civil War, and all that kind of stuff, but there was no attempt to bring us into the experience of it and the horror and the importance of it. There was no attempt, so it made almost no impression. It was just a bunch of left hemisphere words that you had to memorize so you could pass the test, but it didn't have an impact. And I'm hearing that some schools now are making sure that the impact is felt by their students and not just words said that have to be memorized for a test. And I
That's
think
wonderful.
really, really important that
Mm-hmm.
shift is made, I mean, throughout all teaching of history, but especially in this area, because kids then will come up with more and more of a lived sense inside of them instead of this ignoring that is so makes
Yeah.
makes change almost impossible when we're ignoring, you know.
Yeah.
It makes it,
Absolutely.
because my heart would always have wanted to participate more fully, but the
Hmm.
ignoring was so strong that it didn't happen till till recently, except in little fits and starts.
Yeah.
So I so love hearing you talk about community and the richness of that. It's very
Hmm.
filling. A good meal.
Yes, I'm always enjoying the food.
So I think as we have, another half hour to be here, which I'm really grateful again to Bettina for making room for these conversations. That um so what do we need to do to heal? And I think you wanted me to
Yeah, talk
talk
about
about that
healing a bit.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think we need to heal?
Well,
What's the
I
way
think that
forward?
I just read Scientific American had an article by a woman named Abigail Liebers. I don't know if that's how you pronounce her last name, that was actually asking this question: what is it that we know about this? Because her concern is that these trainings that we get in, whether it's at our work or in school or wherever it is, on implicit bias, let's do 3 hours on implicit bias now, actually produce almost no change
Yeah.
for several reasons. One is that's not the only thing that's going on. It's certainly going on. Implicit bias
Mhm.
is certainly going on. And the thing that seems to undercut it the most is getting to have personal relationships with people of color, where our color is still there and our diversity is there, but our common humanity is also there. That seems to be important. And that's a 3 hour course does nothing to do that, to undo any of that. It has to be lived experience. So she really got curious about what does seem to be helpful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and then about a personal piece that's really been with me, as you know, because we've been talking about it for
Mhm.
this last while. But she says one of the most important things we can do is recognize that whiteness is also a racial construct, that I am a person of the white race. I am not the standard for all that is good. I am simply another race with its own way of being in the world, side by side on equal playing field with people in Black bodies, or
Mhm.
people in Asian bodies, or Latinx or indigenous bodies, that we all have our own racial experience, and ours is an experience of whiteness. Because I think one of the most painful or difficult parts of all of this is that what feeds systemic racism is the assumption that to be white is the thing to be, that that's the
Mhm.
superiority, that that's the standard of excellence, which begins to, which where if you don't meet that, you're somehow inferior. And that is just deadly. So I think this
Mhm.
recognition of whiteness as being just another way of being in the world is essential. So I really like that. That felt right on to me and was a very succinct way of saying it.
Yeah.
And then something else she says is that it's so important that we develop compassionate connections with
Mhm.
shared experiences of trauma with people who are marginalized, without ever in any way making that equivalent of what it has been to be a Black person who was enslaved and come from that tradition. But that there are overlaps in our experience. And one that I know I've shared with you was that when you, because of my trauma history, that when you talk about these, your ancestors being enslaved in that position, there were times when I was locked up in where I was in that position.
Yes.
And it was, I don't know how long, because time goes away when you're like that, but it was certainly not days and days on a ship. So it's not equivalent to that, but I know what it is to feel trapped. I know what it is to feel completely
Mhm.
helpless. I know what it is to feel closed in. And if my heart can identify with your heart around that, I'm much more apt to stay with you in the fight than if I'm just doing it for some left hemisphere idealistic.
Absolutely.
There have to be these places of compassion where we make connections with each other around these experiences while fully acknowledging the extent and vastness of what it is that happened to people with
Mhm.
Black bodies. So that's something that where again in our friendship, I feel like we get to do that. We get to share each other's experiences. We get to come together, and that's healing in and of itself, but it also really is glue for us because we can
Yeah.
able to talk about these things. And then the next thing she says, it's so important to engage in learning and planning every single day, that we have to have a consistent new experience to change our brains. And so somehow, some way, this daily email, the Anti-Racism Daily, I think it's just that, antiracismdaily.org, sends me an email that's short, that talks about a particular topic every day. And it's something I have the bandwidth, even on a busy day, to read and take in. It offers ideas of ways to act on this. And I have found it intensely valuable to keep me focused. Even if there's nothing particular about a particular thing that I can do that day, it doesn't get away from me. So I love that it shows up in my inbox every morning. I love that it's short. I love that it's beautifully researched and referenced, and I love that it does sometimes give me things I can actually do, in a particular
Yeah.
area. So that constant engagement. And then the last thing she said was really powerful for me. She says, from the perspective of whiteness, we need to learn about how white supremacy is hurting us too, that the way white supremacy is practiced hurts us, because we are then in a culture that is very left shifted. I would say it's mainly about left hemisphere values.
Mhm.
So there's a sense of perfectionism, there's an urgency to stay on top, there's a defensiveness, there's quantity over quality, there's either or kinds of thinking. And for me, worst of all, the two most hurtful ones are, we are locked into our own individual sense of things as individuals and not part of a community, which is actually, in terms of relational neuroscience, it's actually traumatic for us.
Mhm.
We walked away
Mhm.
as
Yep.
individuals and not have a felt sense of we. But that's what this way of being in white supremacy demands of us. And then also the myth of meritocracy, that if I work hard enough, I can get to the top, which of course from Marshall's poem at the beginning, you can hear that that arrogance, but also the pressure to have to keep moving, 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 and not be vulnerable. So it's really bad for us too. I mean, it's bad for us by reinforcing these things we brought from Europe because of our trauma and because of the ways our brains were rewired. So I mean, there's a way everyone could heal together.
Yes.
And that's again the only way we're going to be able to make this real in the world, is if we all are able to heal together. So somewhere along the line during this, as you know, I got fascinated about how we humans feel about darkness. And it came about darkness, whether it's dark skin, dark nights, dark places inside of us. And it came to me to be curious about it because I was reading an article about colorism, and it said that we know that at least by 700 AD in China, light-skinned people were valued more than dark-skinned people. And that there is a way that somehow those with dark skin in most cultures, but there's no colonialism there, there's nothing, there's just a preference for the light over the dark. And it was so shocking to me in a way. It's like, well, what is it about darkness? And I started to think,
Mhm.
well, in the dark of the night, if I'm sick, I feel more sick. I mean, most of us feel worse at night when we're sick than we do during the day. I think about how the struggle about lightness and darkness even inhabited the African American community, where light-skinned people were valued more than dark-skinned people. I think you told me about the brown paper
Yeah.
test.
Yeah. Well, that is more a product of enslavement than of what you're chatting about now, but definitely.
Right. I think it's on, I agree. It was built in that it's better to look
Yeah.
closer to white than not. And that's
Yeah.
part of our cultural history. But I think there's also a layer of all of this, of separating the darker out as more frightening. There's a way that the kids think that in the dark of the closet is where the monster lives, or in the darkness under the bed, is where this monster lives. And that darkness for us has this quality of the unknown and the uncertain and the mysterious and the uncontrollable and the earthy. And there's a way that white culture values not only whiteness, but what is light, what is certain, what we can pin down, what we can know for sure, and all of these kinds of things, so that we separate off from these more living forces, which are about the earthy and the uncertain and the vulnerable and all of that. We separate our emotions into the good, bright emotions and the negative emotions, when to me, all emotion is just information. It's my system speaking to me.
Yeah.
So I just got to be really interested in that. And I thought, how does this operate person to person? Well, when we have a trauma, what happens is that trauma gets embedded in the darkness of our subconscious, the darkness of our bodies, and we try to stay away from it because it hampers how we meet. So we begin to divide ourselves up into what needs to stay in the dark and what can come into the light, which is our daily, struggle for meritocracy and all these kinds of things. So, our tendency to push away what's in the dark is going to affect how we relate to people with dark skin, I believe. And that it's really important that we begin to find a way that we can welcome in the parts of us that we want to put into the dark, that we can begin to make a gesture of welcome to those parts and be with them, even though they seem so challenging to us at times. But if we don't, we stay separated and we stay in trauma, and then that separates us from our fellow human beings in all the ways that we've talked about. So when we think about the dark, there may be a different way to think about it. I'm looking at my beautiful trees out here. Without the roots that are in the dark, without this whole mat of mycelium that is the conversation between it, those trees don't get to flourish at all. It requires what's in the dark to be part of what's in the light in order for us to be able to really have the experience of wholeness that we want to bring then to the outside world. So all of our efforts toward change in structure and system, I think, has to also be supported by these inner changes where we begin to welcome our wholeness as well, and especially white people with the legacies that we have inside of us through maltreatment of our fellow human beings. We need to be with them, and we need to do it with the support of another. It's like you're always my support, Vanessa, in these explorations. We need each other to listen, to hear the story, to take in the story with us so that it can heal inside of us. So that was long, but those are the pieces that feel
I
important.
love the way you think, my friend. That's beautiful. I could just listen to you talk about your trees and the relationship of their roots and all day.
It's wonderful. We'll go sit under a tree together soon.
Oh, I can't wait to work together and not Zooming or Skyping.
So what do
Oh,
you think, Vanessa? What are the most important pieces for this healing journey now, this racial healing journey toward justice?
something came to mind. It was a favorite quote of mine, and I cannot remember who quoted it, but it just rose as you were talking. So someone may know who said this, but if you have come to rescue me, if you've come to rescue me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then
Mm.
let's do this together.
Oh, that's
And
beautiful.
that is exactly what you were just talking about. So I think it's just that invitation to shift the focus from rescuing people less fortunate or something like that to realizing that we are literally bound together in this effort toward liberation, and that my bondage is your bondage and my liberation is your liberation.
Yes.
And if we can get that on a fundamental level, then our species we can do this, right? We can do this together. So I just start with that. I think a couple things come to mind. One is this idea that we have to know who we are, right? We have to have a sense of living story. You know, I talked earlier about how our story is our medicine. If we don't know who we are and have a sense of living story, it's hard for us to actually create something different. Mm-hmm. It comes forth from us. So I'm going to share, I'm going to share the fundamentals of living story. And I learned this from one of my community elders, one of my shamanic teachers. So I'm just going to share what Ascari has taught me. Ascari has passed now. He was a African storyteller in Portland, Oregon. So this is his teachings that I'm sharing with you now. And he called it sacred storytelling. And in my work with folks around anti-racism, I call it courageous storytelling. Just the courage to know who we are and and when I say storytelling, I don't mean what we talk. For me, story is what I live.
Yes.
So it's a very different, I don't think of it in terms of telling a story. It's a living story. So when I say know your story, it's actually a way of saying, in order to change this, we have to know our life. And we have to know our life in a big way, and also in a deep and practical way.
Yeah.
So there's 6 sacred stories that we live according to Ascari, and I have lived these out. But the first one is, who am I? Like, who am I? And that's like, who are my people? Who are, what are the stories of my people? What is the life of my people, right? What are the values of my people? What are the wounds of my people? Who am I? Because I am the story, the wounds, the values, the medicine of my people. So that's the first story. The next one is, why am I here, right? Why am I here at this moment in time? Why was I born? Why am I here speaking to you? Why am I here with my beloved friend, Bonnie? Why are Bonnie and I here together? Knowing the why, the intention, and that comes from your body, your friends, your people. Like, for me, it's never just me, right? So the why am I here, Bonnie may contribute to why I am here because she is my beloved friend, right? And Joe and all of the people. So why am I here isn't about me figuring out why I'm here. It's about really deeply asking, why am I here? The other one is, what is my vision, right? Vision is really important. What do I see? What am I creating? Because my vision is going to soon be in the world. What I see in my mind and in my heart and in my belly will soon be manifest in the world, right? So I tend carefully my vision, right? So what are my values in action, right? How am I treating this story? How am I acting out my vision? Am I doing it with courage or am I doing it with fear? Am I being intentional or am I avoiding? I'm always doing it in some way, and my values are acting that out. What are the teaching stories that I came to this earth to teach? Right. My teaching stories are about liberation through engagement and community. Right. And I live that story in multiple ways, as a grandmother, as a mother, as a wife, as a friend. Right. I'm living that, those teaching stories, and each and every one of you have those. Mm-hmm. You're living, you're teaching stories too. And then the last one is, what is sacred to my community, right? What is sacred to my people? What must be preserved for the next generation? Right? We are all ancestor and we are all descendant. And so we are the keepers of that. It is precious to us as a species. And right now, right, this moment in time, we are preserving something for the next generation. And it's up to each and every one of us to determine what that is going to be.
Yeah.
Right? And so just, yeah, that is the last sacred story. And these stories that we live, this story medicine that I'm sharing with you, is something that you will live differently at different times in your life. And it will grow and change and move through you in ways I can't imagine, right? Because now they're your stories. Now you carry them. So I just honor that and say, take them and do well with them. And the last thing I want to share about how we heal and what's really critical for our healing is we have to have a vision for a new way of being in this world as a species, right? We need a vision that honors all living beings, and we don't really have a roadmap for that. So our work in this time, for me personally, what I think our work is in terms of healing is to have a clear vision of a future that embodies and holds each and every one of us sacredly. And that really honors the uniqueness of each of us, but also the beauty in that uniqueness, right? Each and every living thing is different from the other living thing. And that is our strength as a species. And so really recognizing that a vision that holds that sacredness is a vision for our future, and that we have to be warriors in holding that and warriors in envisioning that. And we have to be unapologetic about saying that all of us belong here, that each and every one of us is precious, and that not one soul, not one being gets left behind.
Yes.
So that's what I think will help us heal. That's what's rising for me today.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And I think in part two, that speaks to what what we're both saying comes together, because part of that is in welcoming all the parts of our own self so that we can offer that to each other. You know, this is my warty side, this is my struggling side, this is my scared side, and this is my glorious side and my joyous side.
Mm-hmm.
That as we welcome, I can't offer that to you if I don't welcome it in my own self. And so I think it is just
That's it, Bonnie.
something,
That's
yeah. And
yeah.
that's the preciousness of our relationship. I feel like I can tell you anything about the parts of me that struggle and are in pain and are acting dumb, or whatever it might be, and I know I'll still be received. And
It
when
is
we do
welcome.
that inside and outside, then we will have really, I mean, the part about this is going way back to the beginning. We will have returned to our true nature. That's who we actually are. It's not that far out of reach, because that's who we are. And if we can be courageous and brave to tackle the things that block that inside of us, it's very possible that this can happen. And the urgency of it between racial injustice and climate injustice and all of these things, the urgency of these things is right here to prompt us to actually do the work.
Yeah. This is a sacred time.
It
Like
is for time.
we are living in exactly the right time for us to be here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that maybe takes us
All
right
of us.
to our readings that we wanted to do for the end, this idea of it's a sacred time.
Yeah. I hope there's going to be time for questions, but I don't know. Do you want to do yours first, Bonnie, and then I'll do mine?
Yes, because I think it follows right on what you just, what you just said about the sacred time. So this
Go
is
for it, my friend.
a reading from From the Hopi Nation elders in Arizona. There is a river flowing very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold onto the shore. They will feel they are being torn apart and will suffer greatly. Know that this river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above the water. And I say, see who is there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment that we do, our spiritual journey and growth come to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. We are the ones we have been waiting for.
Awesome, awesome. And so my offering is called A Radical Gratitude Spell, and it's by Adrienne Marie Brown. She's a writer and poet. You are a miracle walking. I greet you with wonder in a world which seeks to own your joy and your imagination. You have chosen to be free. Every day as a practice. I can never know the struggles you went through to get here, but I know you have swum upstream, and at times it has been lonely. I want you to know I honor the choices you made in solitude, and I honor the work you have done to belong. I honor your commitment to that which is greater than yourself and your journey to love the particular container of life that is you. You are enough. Your work is enough. You are needed. Your work is sacred. You are here, and I am grateful.
It's so beautiful. And I am so grateful for you. I don't know if we have time like for one question maybe at the end. And
I
that's
hope
probably
so.
not fair for Risha to ask her to pick one out of what may be a lot. But I wonder if we could do that, Risha. Is there something?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got,
Thank you.
we just have a couple.
Oh, great.
One is, I'd love to hear more about what Vanessa alluded to earlier, her choice of the word enslaved versus a slave.
Okay, great. Well, that is from one of the elders who's passed now, Lucille Clifton. She's a poet. My father died about 10 years ago, and I went to see Lucille, who I just love. And I was talking to her about my work and said, as a descendant of slaves is how I spoke to her. And Lucille said, let me stop you. And she said, I never want you to use the word slave in relation to yourself again. I want you to always say enslaved, because we were never slaves. No human is ever a slave. We are enslaved. And that puts the accountability on those who caused the harm. So that is why I use it that way.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that's so right. I mean, it's the change. I can feel the change when you say it that way. The difference.
Well, nothing like when an elder tells you what to do.
It's always helpful.
Say, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Lucille.
And then the next question we had was, can you please talk more about the way towards healing is justice? I don't think this is well understood, but I'd like to learn more about your perspective.
Do you want to start with that one, Bonnie, since I did the...
No, I think I'd like you to start with that one too, because I think you will have something. Yes, I'd be glad to add something, but I'd like to hear you, if that's okay.
Yeah. The way toward healing is justice. Like, I feel that so profoundly in my body. I'm going to try really hard to quickly put it in words. But there's a wound that happens with injustice. It is a fundamental wound to who we are as spiritual beings. And that wound violates the reverence of who and what we are. And so injustice is such a foundational wounding of the human spirit, that justice is the medicine. And we'll know that we are different once justice is fully actuated into the world. Like we will know the difference. We'll feel it in our bodies, that when we are just to others and we are receiving a just environment, we're going to feel so whole that it's gonna be night and day. Or yeah, that's what I would say about that. What about you, Bonnie?
Yeah, as you're saying that, I mean, justice to me means that each person is held as equal value,
Hmm.
and that until we can do that, there is going to be the wounds inside of us that come from being oppressed or oppressor, that there's wounding, that because that's not how we're meant to be. And that as we change that and we come into just relationship as best we human can with all of our flaws, but that's the core of it, that there is something that is so healing and balancing for that, for us, for all of us. And then we can give it to the planet, because if we aren't able to hold the planet in that kind of interconnected care, we don't stand a chance. So.
Yeah. And I do want to say that for me, justice is about equity and equality and all of those things. But justice to me also has a restorative factor that goes backwards and restores harm done.
Yes.
So there is a way that justice includes that restorative justice and that piece that honors the woundedness behind us, as well as the healed self that we're sending forward.
Yes, and there has been a movement in some schools where they were trying in an anti-racism way to punish the kids that were doing racist things, and they're now moving to a restorative model where there's conversation, not just between the two people involved, but in the whole community.
Yes.
So that restorative justice piece, I think, is absolutely crucial, again, to reuniting us, to find a healing in the midst of it. Absolutely.
Yeah. I just didn't want to, because sometimes justice can, I'm going to remember to add restorative when I'm talking, just to make sure that doesn't get misunderstood again.
Yeah, I think we're at the end, my friend.
We are. Thank you, everyone, for being in community with us, being in circle with us. I watched a lot of your chats. You are an amazing group. It's been an honor to be in your presence. And thank you, Bonnie, for holding space for all that I brought to the table today. It was I'm carrying, the loss of my mother, but hopefully I did honor to her life today.
It feels so to me, my dear. When you talk, I think it's healing for anyone who gets to listen to you.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. We will depart now.
Bye. Have a good Sunday.
Have a very good Sunday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.